Good evening and welcome. The Holy Temple, its history, importance, and structure. Tonight's class is an interactive class, and I ask you if there's any questions to please feel free to chat them and write them. And at different points throughout the class, we will try to answer all the questions. I encourage you all, on top of the screen, you will see a place to print out a handout that will have all of the sources we will discuss, and if you would like, you could certainly print that out. Mr. David Chase, a well-known philanthropist and community activist, was on his private yacht out in the sea. And he comes one day to the captain and he says, "Captain, which direction is east?" The captain looks at him and he's wondering why. Why would the man who owns the yacht want to know where east is? Does he want to become a captain? But without asking any questions, he says, "East is in that direction." Yet when this repeats itself numerous times over the next few days, the captain builds up the courage and he says, "Mr. Chase, why do you want to know where east is?" "I am a Jew," Mr. Chase says, "and I pray to God. And whenever I pray, I face east. I have 3 questions for all of you here. First of all, why do we face east when we pray? Second of all, if we face east when praying, because that is where the temple is, if we face east, we're facing Israel, we're facing the Holy Temple, but there's no Holy Temple today. So why are we facing there today? And third of all, is it important enough to bother the captain? Is facing east so important? Jacob, the third of our forefathers, was threatened for his life by his brother Esau. He had to run away. He was worried his brother was ready, God forbid, to murder him. And he had to run away. On his way to his uncle's house, where he was going to stay until his brother's wrath and anger had subsided and calmed down, he goes to sleep. And during his sleep, he has a dream. There's a ladder going to heaven. There's angels going up and down. And when he awakens, let's look at text number 1 together on the handout. When he awakens, Jacob says, "Indeed, the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was frightened, and he said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Jacob had gone to sleep and had had that dream where the temple would be built in over 500 years. Now I ask you, what does it mean? This is the gate of heaven. Why are we looking for the gate of heaven? Thank God we're all here on earth, and we want to remain on earth. We want to be able to fulfill the Torah and His commandments. Why are we looking for heaven? Rabbi Shlomo Ganzfried, the author of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, he compiled the necessary laws that are applicable for every person. And he writes, he quotes this passage, and he gives us a little meaning to it. Let's look at text number 2. A person must stand, he's talking about while we are praying, the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, a person must stand facing Israel. He should have the intention of facing Jerusalem, the temple, the Holy of Holies. All Jews direct their prayer to one place. And he concludes, because this is the gateway to heaven, since all prayers rise up in this direction. Through the Holy Temple, all the prayers rise up. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who lived over 300 years ago, he had the opportunity to go to 2 synagogues. He walks into the first synagogue and he sees everyone there is praying with emotion. You can't hear any sound aside from the sound of prayer. You enter the synagogue and you get caught up with the feeling, the yearning to connect yourself with God. And the students, they are all impressed. And they walk out with their holy rabbi, holy Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov turns to them and he says, this synagogue, it's empty of prayer. The students are all wondering, empty of prayer? That is the ultimate synagogue. But you don't ask questions. And they continue on to the next synagogue. Over there, they find everyone talking. They're discussing business, the latest politics. There's no sound of prayer. In between, while you have a minute, you're listening to your friend, you pray. You don't have that feeling, that yearning, that connection. And the students are not very impressed with that synagogue. And they leave. And the Baal Shem Tov, the holy Baal Shem Tov turns to them and he says, that synagogue is full of prayer. And the students are baffled. Whoa. The synagogue where everyone was caught up in prayer is empty of prayer. And this synagogue where no one is praying is full of prayer. And one of the students builds up the courage and he turns to the Baal Shem Tov and he says, Holy Rebbe, please clarify. What is the meaning of this? How could this be? And the Baal Shem Tov turns to them and he says, when we pray, our prayer ascends to heaven through angels. The first synagogue we went to was empty of prayer because the angels, they were so caught up with the prayer, they took the prayer straight through the Holy Temple straight to heaven. It went straight up to God. The second synagogue was full of prayer. The angels created from that prayer were crippled. They remained in the synagogue. It wasn't able to go up and elevate, go to heaven, go in front of God. Our prayers through the Holy Temple ascend to Hashem, ascend to God. How could that be? Through the Holy Temple, you're telling me that prayer ascends to God? We all know the world is full of godliness. God is everywhere. Malei kol haaretz kivodo. The whole world is full of his glory. That's why we are all dispersed throughout the world, to reveal that godliness that's there. So what do you mean that the gateway to heaven is the temple? God is everywhere. This is not my question. This question is asked by the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, the Alter Rebbe. In the Tanya, chapter 51 and 52, the Alter Rebbe discusses this question itself. He says, what do you mean that the Holy Temple is a source of godliness? God is everywhere. Imagine you're driving on the side of the road, you're driving on the road itself, and you have a policeman following you wherever you go. When I drive, and I have a policeman driving right behind me, I get nervous. I'm always on the lookout. Am I going the correct speed limit? Do I have my blinkers on when they need to be on? My lights on? I'm always checking, making sure everything's appropriate. Imagine we were being followed a whole day by a policeman. We would be very careful what we would do. We would always try and be doing the correct thing. This example, in a tiny way, would maybe be an example if godliness was revealed throughout the entire world. If we could perceive and feel godliness clearly, without any work and effort, we would be angels. We wouldn't have free choice. The foundation of the world is free choice. It's one of the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides sets forth. The only possibility and way for there to be free choice is by God concealing himself throughout the entire world. As you could see in text number 3, the quote from the Tanya, godliness is everywhere, but through the temple, through the Beis Hamikdash, godliness is revealed, is spread out, I should say, and energizing the entire world. Because in the Temple Mount, in the Holy Temple, in the Beis Hamikdash, the Har HaBayis over there, it's revealed. So the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, is the gateway to heaven, and godliness is revealed there. What does it mean godliness is revealed there? Was it tangible? Was it physical? Was there anything that happened at the Temple Mount that I was able to see revealed godliness, see miracles? Throughout the months, from Pesach, Passover, till Rosh Hashanah, it is our custom to say Pirkei Avos, ethics of the fathers, ethics of our fathers. Every Shabbos afternoon after Mincha, every Saturday afternoon after the afternoon prayer. And in chapter 5, Mishnah 5, the Mishnah sets forth 10 miracles that happened in the Holy Temple. And I want to share with you 2 miracles specifically. 3 times a year, all Jewish people, the Torah tells us, the Bible tells us, should gather together in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple. When the Jewish people would gather together, we're talking about tens of thousands of people gathering together in the Holy Temple. Tens of thousands of people. When they would gather together, they were squished together, packed together. If any of you have ever been in 770 for the high holy days, whether it's Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, then you would probably know what it means to be packed together like sardines. They were packed together. The Jewish people, we were packed together in the Holy Temple throughout these 3 festivals. And yet, although during most of the time there was no room to move, when it would come to when we would confess, say vidoi, when we would prostrate ourselves and talk to God privately, all of a sudden, an area of 6 feet by 6 feet would open up. Every single person had their own private area of 6 feet to allow them to say private things to God that no one else should hear. That means the Holy Temple all of a sudden expanded. It probably expanded bigger than the whole Yerushalayim, the whole Jerusalem. We're talking every single person had 6 feet to himself. A clear miracle. The Talmud and Tractate Yoma tells us, and let's read it together, text 5. It's a little cryptic. The measure of the Aron HaKodesh, the Ark, the Holy Ark, was not included in the total measure of the span of the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. So that means the Ark, the measurement of the Ark was not included in the measurement of the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was 10 amos, 15 feet wide, 15 feet long. The ark itself was approximately 4 feet long. So let's do the math. Let's minus 4 feet from 15 feet. That means we're left with 11 feet. If you would measure from one side of the room to the ark and the other side of the room to the ark, you should only find 11 feet. You should only find 5.5 feet on each side. And yet, when they would do the measurements, there would be 7.5 feet on each side, and a total of 15 feet. That means the measurement of the ark was non-existent. And yet when they would measure the ark on its own, it would be 4 feet. There was a clear miracle. The place where God rested on the holy ark, it was not there. And it was there at the same time. It was Nimna Hanimnos. A clear miracle is happening. So yes, godliness was clearly revealed in the Holy Temple. So we know godliness was revealed in the Holy Temple. But that's when the temple stood. Is godliness revealed today? Is there holiness in the Temple Mount today? What about the Western Wall? I see everyone goes there. Is it a holy place? And why today are we facing that direction? Let's look together at text number 6. It's clear the Midrash, expounding on the words of the Bible, the Torah, in Exodus, has an argument. And let's see the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Ach. Rabbi Eliezer says, the divine presence never departed from the temple. Even when the temple is destroyed, it remains in its sanctity. And even when it is destroyed, God does not leave it. God is in the holy temple. The same holiness that was there when the temple stood is there today. Rabbi Acha, he says a little differently. He says the holiness today is specifically on the Western Wall. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, will never depart from the Western Wall. The Western Wall that we have standing today is the holiest place in the whole world. Yes, today we may not see the godliness revealed there, and we may not see the holy temple, but God is with us. He is with us. He is with us, and He's protecting us. Can you think of a reason why the Temple Mount specifically was chosen for this holy task? Why was the temple built where it is today? Why not somewhere else? Is there any points that set a standard showing us that the Temple Mount is the place where the temple belongs? Maimonides, when he discusses the place where the altar stood in the Holy Temple, he actually gives us a little history. And you can see that in text number 7. But Maimonides tells us that the place where the temple stood, first of all, that is where the world began to be created. That means that the world wasn't created just as a globe all at once. The world began where the Holy Temple stands, and then the rest of the globe was completed. Following that, after Adam himself was created from the area of the Holy Temple, the ark that he built to bring sacrifices to God was in that same area of the Holy Temple. The ark which his children, Cain and Hevel, created and built there and brought their sacrifices was on the Holy Temple. Noah, after leaving the ark, he brought his sacrifices on the Holy Temple. Abraham, the first of the 3 forefathers, he bound up his son Isaac and was about to bring his son as a sacrifice on the site of the Holy Temple. Many years later, King David brought a sacrifice on the site of the Holy Temple. But let me share with you how this came about. We don't count people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We count people using a different method, an indirect method. Let me give you 2 examples. When the Jewish people were in the desert, Moshe wanted to count everyone. How did he count them? He told each person to bring a coin, and by counting all the coins together, we would be able to know how many people there were. Similarly, King Saul, Shaul HaMelech, when he wanted to count how many people there were, he told each person to bring an animal as a sacrifice. He counted all of them, and now we know how many people there were. King David HaMelech, he went ahead and he also counted the Jewish people. But he counted them directly. 1, 2, 3. And a plague broke out. A devastating plague. And the plague stopped in the house of a man named Aravna. To be precise, in his back house, where he would thresh the grain that he had. King David realized there's a miracle happening, and he brought a sacrifice there. That threshing house of the man named Aravna, that was the site that the Holy Temple was going to be built. And King David purchased the land from Aravna. And that was the purchase of the Holy Temple. Let's make a summary of where we're holding, and then we'll take a few questions. The Holy Temple is the gateway to heaven. All our prayers are sent through there. Godliness is revealed on the Temple Mount, as we discussed some miracles that happened there. And even today, when we may not see the Holy Temple, the holiness is complete there. Let's take a few questions. Okay, I see a nice point from Derek. Thank you. I believe that when Mashiach comes, chesed, kindness, will come from the outside. In order to have an outside, you need an inside, hence a Beit HaMikdash. Thank you. Thank you, Derek. Let's take one more question. Okay, good question. We have a question. Who built the second temple? Let's leave that towards the end of the history. Thank you very much for those questions. Of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask. Let's talk a little bit about the history. And when we talk about the history, we're going to focus on the history of the first temple. King David, after he bought this piece of land from Aravna, he wanted to build the Holy Temple, and who wouldn't? The house of God, a place where godliness is going to be revealed. Who wouldn't want to build it? But God said, no, it's not for you. Your son Solomon will build it. And there was 2 reasons that God didn't want King David to build it. Number 1, the temple is a place of peace, of no fighting. King David has solidified and made Israel a safe place for the Jewish people. One of the most important things a Jew could do. Protect your fellow Jews. But yet at the end of the day, he hadn't been involved in warfare. And God said, the place of the temple, I don't want built by a man who has war and blood on his hands. A second reason, King David was so holy, anything he would build would never be able to be destroyed. We know 410 years after the first temple would be created, it would be destroyed. And God did not want to come to a situation where he wouldn't be able to destroy the temple. And so he asked King David to please not build it. King David did, as I say, purchase the land. And similarly, he also built some of the vessels of the temple, and those vessels actually were never destroyed. They're hidden underground. On the festival of Shavuot, in the year 2924, in the English calendar, 837 years before the Common Era, King David passes away. At the young age of 12, King Solomon takes rule of the Jewish people. God asks him, What could I offer you? What would you like to be blessed with? King Solomon says, I would like an understanding heart to lead and judge the Jewish people. What a special request. What a special request. I don't want riches. I don't want fame. I want an understanding heart. Why? To be able to lead and judge the Jewish people. God was very happy with this request, and thus King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, became the smartest man. 4 years into the rule of King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, he begins the construction of the first Beis HaMikdash. The construction itself was a tremendous task that is going to take 7 years. We're building the palace to God. We want the best. Kol chelev lahavaya. We take the best and the choicest of all material when we're building God's temple. And therefore, people were sent to Lebanon to cut down cedar trees. People were sent to Tyre, a city within Lebanon, to bring back the best and most well-known craftsmen to help build the Holy Temple. People, of course, had to go to the quarries and bring these rocks through which the Holy Temple would be constructed. Ships were sent around all over to bring the best of all material. Tens of thousands of people were involved in this holy task. Now, I want to share with you. As I mentioned before, the temple is a place of peace. No iron was allowed to be used in the construction of the temple. How could you build a magnificent edifice without breaking everything to size? Like everything, there's two opinions. One opinion shares with us that there was a worm, the Shamir worm, a miraculous worm that God created at the beginning of creation, that whenever it would be placed on something would cut it in half, and that worm was found by King Solomon, and was used in order to cut the stones to the precise measurement. A second opinion shares with us that iron was not allowed to be used on the site of the Holy Temple itself, but was allowed to be used outside of the Holy Temple. So the stones were cut outside of the Holy Temple and brought and placed to their appropriate area in the Holy Temple. After 7 years, in the 12th year of King Solomon's reign, on the 7th day of Tishrei, 3 days prior to the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, the temple is complete. Thousands of people join together to see the Chanukas Habayis, the most magnificent edifice and building ever, being sanctified to God. King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, goes to Ir David, the city of David, where the ark was until then. And he, together with all the Jewish people, brings to the ark, and as they proceed with the ceremony, they come and they approach the Holy Temple to bring it inside of the Holy of Holies. And the temple doors lock. They won't allow the ark in. King Solomon prays to God. He says, please, God, allow us to bring this building to fruition. Allow the ark to go to its appropriate resting place. The doors don't open. King Solomon says numerous prayers, the door won't open, until King Solomon says, for the sake of my father, King David, please allow the ark to enter, and the doors open. And the ark was put in its appropriate resting spot. At that time, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, descended over the Holy Temple, and it was clear to everyone that God is resting with us in the Holy Temple. The celebration of the Holy Temple being dedicated lasted for 14 days. The Holy Temple is the center of our heart. How many times throughout the prayer do we mention the Holy Prayer? And we ask God our eyes should see when in mercy you return and bring us all together to the Holy Temple. It's the center of our life. Joy. We have never experienced joy, the Talmud tells us. Real joy was only experienced in the Holy Temple on the festival of Sukkot, when the Jewish people would dance and celebrate. That was real joy. A beautiful building, beauty in architecture was never seen, aside for the building of the second temple. How we yearn and how we pray to God to please return us to the Holy Temple. Alas, and sad to say, the golden era of King Solomon ended with his passing. And in the year 2964, or in the English calendar, 797 years before the Common Era, King Solomon passed away. His son, Rehoboam, took over the leadership of the Jewish people. The Jewish people turned to Rehoboam and they say, Rehoboam, what type of a leader are you going to be? Are you going to lead us with compassion, or are you going to be strict and tough? Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to get back to you. Throughout those 3 days, he talks to his advisors. The older and wiser advisors tell him, as a leader, you should be more compassionate. That was not the answer he wanted, and he sent them away. He gathers together the younger advisors, and he says, advisors, advise me. What type of a leader should I be? They tell him, be harsher and tougher, and put on a lot of taxes on the Jewish people. King Solomon hears this. Rehoboam, King Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon, hears this, and he returns 3 days later to the Jewish people, and that's exactly what he says. He says, I will lead you with an iron hand. He was not ready for what would happen next. 10 of the 12 tribes split away and said, we will not allow you to rule over us. We are going to create our own kingdom. And from then on, the Jewish people were split into 2 sections, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Yehuda of Judea. Now, the Holy Temple itself, as I mentioned before, is the heart, the home of the Jewish people. And that was in the kingdom of Judea, of Yehuda. And the ruler, the king, over the Jewish people, the kingdom of Israel, knew that his rulership will never be solidified unless he could somehow remove the Jewish people from their connection to the temple. If they're every few months going to be going to the temple, if they're going to need the temple, then his kingdom will never be strong. And at that point, alas, and sad to say, he introduced to the Jewish people idol worship. And idol worship took a major role in the lives of the Jewish people. Less than 100 years, actually more than 100 years, after the first temple was completed, a terrible tragedy took place on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. The Jewish people are all gathered together in the Holy Temple, and the prophet Zechariah ben Yehoiada gives a prophecy how the king is not acting appropriately. And the Jewish people stoned the prophet Zechariah to death. A terrible, terrible tragedy. For the next 252 years that the Holy Temple will stand, the blood of Zechariah the prophet never stopped bubbling and would never sink into the ground. It always remained where he had been murdered and killed, near the holy, near inside of the Holy Temple. Many years later, in the years 3187, in the English calendar, 574 before the Common Era, and for the next 18 years, the 10 tribes that were part of the Kingdom of Israel are going to be conquered and moved out of the land of Israel and will never be heard from again until today. Until today, we don't know where those 10 tribes are. In their place, the Assyrian king brought other people who throughout the history of the Jews would cause a lot of damage and harm. For 150 more years after the 10 tribes had been exiled and moved aside, the kingdom of Yehuda remained. The kingdom of Judea remained. Throughout the 410 years that the Holy Temple stood, some of the greatest prophets lived. For example, Elijah the prophet, Yonah, the prophet Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, Yeshaya, Isaiah, the holiest prophets lived. And I want to share with you some details of the prophet Yirmiyah, the prophet Jeremiah, that were connected to the terrible destruction of the temple. 18 years before the destruction of the first holy temple, in approximately the year 3321, 440 before the Common Era, Yirmiyah was imprisoned by the king for his constant prophecy to the Jewish people about the downfall of the Holy Temple and the Jewish people if a change won't happen. He was imprisoned. And while he is imprisoned, he dictates the Book of Lamentations to his disciple and student, Baruch ben Neriah. He dictates the Book of Lamentations and tells his students to go to the Holy Temple and read out loud this book. And of course, he follows his teacher to the letter. He goes to the Holy Temple, he reads it out loud. And a messenger is sent to the king that the student of Jeremiah has said this terrible prophecy to all the Jewish people. The king immediately calls Baruch ben Neriah to his palace. The letter, this book is read in front of him. And he is so frustrated with the prophecy and so mad, he takes it and he throws it into the fireplace that was in front of him. When that happened, the prophet Jeremiah sat down and composed the last and final chapter of Lamentations, which until then had not been written. Alas, in the year 3338, on the 9th day of the month of Tammuz, the Babylonian army surrounded the walls of Jerusalem and broke through. They broke through, and that was the beginning of the final destruction of the temple. On the 7th day of Av, 2 days before the actual burning of the Holy Temple, the chief of the Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar's army, Nebuzaradan, began the destruction of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. All the walls of the city are torn down, and the royal palace and other structures within the city are set on fire. Nebuzaradan enters the Holy Temple. And as he's going to the Holy Temple, he sees that blood boiling from over 252 years ago, the blood of the prophet Zechariah ben Yehoiada. And he turns to the Jewish people and he says, what is this? The Jewish people, of course, don't want to share. And he threatens them and he says, if you don't tell me what happened, I will go ahead and comb your flesh with iron combs. We can't imagine what the Jewish people went through at that time. And the Jewish people tell them the story, how they had stoned the prophet Zechariah. Nebuzaradan says, I will appease the blood of the prophet. And he takes the men of the high court and he slaughters them over the blood of the prophet, and the blood does not stop bubbling. He murders the holy people of the smaller court of law. He murders young boys, young girls. He murders a total of 940,000 people, and the blood still did not stop bubbling. And at that point, Nebuzaradan turns to the prophet Zechariah and says, Zechariah, Zechariah, I have slain the best of them. Do you want all of them to be destroyed? And at that time, the blood of the prophet sank into the ground. 2 days later, the holy temple was set on fire. The fire lasted throughout the entire day of the 9th and continued through half of the day of the 10th day of Av. While the fire was burning, the young priests, the young Kohanim, went up on top of the holy temple, and they took the keys of the temple, and they declared, Master of the world, since we have not merited to be trustworthy custodians, let the keys be given back to you. And they took the keys of the holy temple and they threw them to heaven. A hand came out and took the keys, and they threw themselves into the fire. The story of the destruction of the first temple, and similarly the second temple, is a tragedy which cannot be understood. Our heart goes out when we hear the story of the destruction. Similarly, when we hear the story of the Jewish people throughout times, the tragedies that have stood by us. Let me take a few questions at this point, and then we'll continue on. I want to answer a previous question: who destroyed the second temple? The second temple was destroyed by the Romans. I'm looking back now by who built the second temple. The second temple was built by a group of people, and they were under the leadership of Ezra the scribe, Ezra HaSofer. We have over here a question, a good question. What is the mystical relationship between the author of the Zohar and the destruction of the temple? It's a very good question. Maybe after the class, we'll answer it in the chat, but I'd like to focus now on the story and history of the destruction and building of the temple. Thank you again for all those that are asking questions. Feel free to ask your own. If the Beis Hamikdash is not built in your lifetime, it's as if it has been destroyed during your life. What can we do then to rebuild the temple? What can we do? We don't want to be an active participant of the destruction. If it's not built in our lifetime, it's as if it's destroyed. What can we do to rebuild it? Well, let's look at the cause. What was the cause of the destruction of the first and similarly the second temple, the second Beis Hamikdash? If we look in text number 8 on the handout from the Talmud Tractate Yuma, page 9b, the Talmud shares with us that the two temples were destroyed for different reasons. The first temple, why was the first sanctuary destroyed? Because of 3 evil things: idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. Continues the Talmud. But why was the second temple destroyed? During the times of the second temple, we didn't have this idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. Why then was a second temple destroyed? Says the Talmud, because therein prevailed hatred without cause. That teaches you that groundless hatred is considered as of even greater gravity than the three signs of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. Wow, wow. The first temple was destroyed, and the whole exile was only 70 years. The sins of idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed were able to be solved through an exile of 70 years. The sin of hatred without cause has left us in exile for over 2,000 years already. It's tremendous. The lesson is tremendous. Hating someone without reason is terrible. What lesson we take out? If we want to rebuild, if we want to bring back the third temple, we then have to go ahead and have love without cause. We have to love another person for no reason. If you meet someone on the street, you've never met him, you don't know who he is. He lives in Australia and you live in America. You live in India and he lives in Turkey. You need to love him. Love without reason. Ahavas china. That is what will bring back the third temple. So we've discussed the holiness of the temple. We've spoken about the history of the temple. And let's for a few moments discuss the structure of the Holy Temple. I have in front of me a model of the second temple, and we'll try together to look at it and talk about a few of the main parts of the temple. On your handout, the second page, there's a beautiful diagram of the temple. So as I'm showing you the picture, I will also tell you the number on your diagram where you could be looking, where the area we are discussing would be found on your paper. Here you could all see the Holy Temple. Let's go through the front entrance. You go through the front entrance, and immediately you would find yourself in an area that was called the Woman's Courtyard, the Ezras Nashim. Why was it called the Woman's Courtyard? A very fascinating story the Talmud shares with us, that during the festival of Sukkot, as I mentioned earlier, all Jewish people would come and celebrate the festival together. Men, women, and children would come. Now, of course, we don't want to mix men and women together. Holiness is when we're able to focus on the holiness and not get caught up in other things. So therefore, the men and women were separated. This is actually one of the first and original sources we have of the separation between men and women during prayer, the mechitza in the synagogue that you find. So the woman actually would stand on the ledges. There was a very special and nice area built for the woman to stand on the balcony of the courtyard. Inside you could find 4 rooms, one in each corner. Each one of these rooms had a special purpose. We're going to now discuss, if you look on your chart, room 5, 6, 7, and 8. We'll go through briefly what each one of them had. Inside of room number 5, that was called the Lishkas Hashmanim, where over there you would find oil, wine, and flour that was to be used for sacrifices. Let's turn now to the room number 6. In room number 6, that was called Lishkas HaMitzoyroim. It was a place where a person that had become impure could go down inside of it and find a pool of water, a mikvah, to immerse himself and purify himself. Room number 7. Inside of room number 7, this area was called the Lishkas HaNazirim. Inside of this area here, a Nazir, a man who had taken a vow to abstain from drinking wine and had let his hair grow long, he would bring his sacrifice. He would actually cook it inside of this room, and then, after cutting his hair, he would burn the hair in a fire inside of this room. And let's conclude now with room number 8. Inside of room number 8, that was called Lishkas HaEitzim, where the wood for the altar was found. This was the woman's courtyard. Let's now go inside of the inner courtyard, or it's sometimes referred to as the Ezras Yisrael, Ezras Koyanim, dependent on where exactly you're talking. Inside of that area, and on the sheet we're going to be discussing the general area number 3, you had the altar where sacrifices were brought. On the right-hand side of it, you had an area where the sacrifices were actually slaughtered and skinned. You know, I want to share with you quickly the story of the gate, of the doors that led into this holy area here. There was a man who wanted to go ahead and bring a present for the holy temple. And he decided, what could he do? What could he offer? He'll bring the 2 doors. The 2 doors to enter into the holy temple. He was on a boat. He took the 2 doors. And yet the boat was going to sink if both doors would be on it. And so he had to take one of the doors and throw it into the sea. He was heartbroken. He had invested his whole life into the beauty of God's temple, to making a beautiful edifice. But he had no choice, and he continued on to Israel. And a miracle happened. When he got there, when he got to the coast, and when he parked the boat, sitting right there was the other door. When you want to do something, when you're working together with God, God will provide and give you whatever necessary. So we've gone through the inner area of section number 3. And let's now discuss this building itself. There was 2 parts. You had number 2, as you could see in number 1. Number 2 was called the holy. Inside of the holy, we had the menorah. We all know the menorah from Hanukkah. The menorah stood in the holy, in the Kodesh. Similarly, we had the shulchan. We had the table where the showbread was placed. And lastly, we had the golden altar, the Mizbeach HaZahav, where incense, the ketoris, were brought. That was the holy. And let's discuss now the Holy of Holies, the holiest place in the whole world, a place where only once a year the Kohen was allowed to enter. And it was such a holy time when he would enter. If he was not worthy, he would die. During the Second Temple, when the high priest was bought from the government and people were not worthy of it, many of the people died. The Holy of Holies, where the ark stood. The holiest place on earth. Let's make a little summary of what we've discussed today. We discussed the holiness of the Holy Temple, of its site, and how it's holy even today. We spoke about the history of the first temple, and alas, its destruction. And we discussed a little bit of the structure of the Holy Temple. And let me conclude with the prayer. Sheyibane Beis Hamikdash b'mehera v'yameinu V'sein chelkeinu b'soirasecha, that the holy temple should be built speedily in our days. And we should be able to focus completely on the Torah and on godliness. It's been my pleasure to take this journey with you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now. We have over here a question from L'Shem Shamayim. Very good question. What is the Even HaShasiyah? There's a rock that is called the foundation rock. Shasiyah actually comes from the word of foundation. It's the foundation of the world. As I mentioned earlier, the world was begun. The creation began on the site of the Holy Temple, but to be precise, it actually began at a specific stone called the Even HaShasiyah. Some people say that stone is the stone in the Dome of the Rock. It's a controversy dependent on different sources, whether it's the Kabbalah or the Talmud. It's not clear exactly where that rock is. But that rock certainly is one of the holiest places we have in the entire world. Very good question. Are there any other questions? I would like to wish everyone a wonderful night. And thank you very much to JNet and Chabad.org for putting together this class. Good night.